Do you ever wonder why this particular story is in Scripture? This story of Jesus going in and cleansing the temple? I do. But it's actually in all four of the Gospels. And so it must signify something important, right? But it's such a different way of seeing Jesus. I can't think of any other instance in any of the Gospels where we see Jesus so angry. Now, it's not that he doesn't show emotion. He often seems to get peeved or annoyed with his disciples, and who can blame him? That they were sometimes really annoying. We see him weep at the death of Lazarus. So it's not that he's a stoic man, but he's a pretty composed man. And so this story of him coming into the temple and being so angry is odd. Now, part of the problem, I think, is that many of us have a problem with anger, period. We have a problem being around angry people. We have a problem getting in fights in which people are angry. We have problems with our own anger. So part of the discomfort with this story could very much come from our own stuff and our comfort with anger per se, which is something most of us try to avoid. But nonetheless, as I said, this particular story is in all four Gospels. So we have to deal with it, like it or not. Now, in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, synoptic meaning similar, coming from similar sources, this particular story comes at the very end of Jesus' ministry, the end of Jesus' life. He's made the triumphant return into Jerusalem, and then he goes into the temple and upturns the tables and scatters the animals. It becomes one of the pretexts for his arrest. In John's Gospel, however, it's just the opposite. It comes at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. He's done, at least according to the Gospel, one act of power, and that is in Cana when he turns the water to wine at the wedding. People notice it. Of course they do. And so they begin to follow him. And then he goes to Jerusalem to observe the Passover, goes into the temple, and chaos ensues. Now, it's easy to get caught up in this narrative, like he goes from Cana to Jerusalem, cleansing of the temple. But we need to slow down a bit and remember something. And that is that Jesus was an observant Jew. He was raised as an observant Jew. So chances are he'd been to Jerusalem in the temple many, many times over the course of his life, and what he saw there would be nothing new. This was a legitimate business endeavor or worship endeavor in which the money changers would be there, and then the people selling the animals for the ritual sacrifices. He would have seen this time and time again. And so it's not like he walked into the temple this time and saw this going on for the very first time. So chances are he walked in knowing exactly what he was going to see, and chances are he knew exactly what he was going to do. His actions in the temple at this time were a statement. Now, turning the water into wine was impressive, but it really didn't say anything about who or what Jesus was. This, in turn, was like throwing down the gauntlet, because it was a sign that business as usual was over. It would no longer be tolerated. The status quo had changed dramatically. Of course, in the moment, no one knew this. All they knew is that this man had gone in and was, made this whip and was creating, as I said, chaos there in the temple. So the Jewish authorities go to him and say, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" In other words, who do you think you are? Now, he and Jesus, the authorities and Jesus have some back and forth here. But I sometimes wonder if Jesus at this point in time fully understood who and what he was himself. I mean, he was a young man. He was coming into himself. He was coming into this phase of his life in which he would change everything. But even if he understood things imperfectly, he knew enough that all the hopes and the dreams and the desires that were associated with the temple could now be found in him. A big change. So what Jesus did this day was a bold, maybe a foolhardy move, but it foreshadowed what Jesus was all about. As we go through the Gospels, it's hard to think of even one person that comes into contact with Jesus that isn't somehow changed. They may not fully understand the change, chances are they don't, but he had this ability to simply change things, change people by his very presence. And this very presence was then a radical disruption, a radical interruption of the status quo. So on this third weekend in Lent, what are we to make of all of this? Well, as painful and disorienting as it can be, we often need a radical disruption, a radical interruption to make us see beyond business as usual and beyond the status quo. Now, obviously, this last year, for many of us, provided such a radical disruption, such a radical interruption, and I do not for a minute believe that God sent these things to us so we would have these radical disruptions and interruptions, but they did happen. The pandemic, the demonstrations, some of which turned violent last summer over racism and racial inequality, and of course, the attack recently on the Capitol. These were profound disruptions, interruptions that shook us to the core. But it wasn't just that. They also then disrupted us on many, many, many levels. Think about it. Think about all the things that you have gone through over the last year. I know for me, I've learned a lot about myself. I've learned a lot about what's important to me. I've learned a lot about what I can do better. I've learned a lot about what I turn away from when I shouldn't. I've learned a lot about how I could love God better. It's been sobering. The biggest change for me, or the biggest thing I think I realized, is that how much I miss people, how much I miss touch, how precious life is. Some of you know this, but my husband was in the hospital for 3 weeks in the fall, and I couldn't see him. I couldn't get there. I tried. I tried to be the spouse, couldn't go in. I tried to be a chaplain. They wouldn't let me in. And I understand safety. It was about safety. But it was devastating. And I'm not the only person with these kinds of stories. No, lucky he was okay. But I learned a lot about what life was without him during this time. So we have to take into account that these disruptions might not always be pleasant, but they're necessary. There is a priest named Michael Marsh who just wrote this beautiful, beautiful quote. Jesus continues to overturn and throw up business as usual because the truth is there's still a Samaritan woman waiting at the well in our world today. There are still lame people grounded by business as usual. Empty and hungry people are still a reality in our world, and there are dead people waiting to be made alive. Regardless of who we are, what we've done or left undone, or how we see or judge our life, we are the temple of God, and there is one who stands in the temple of our life, interrupting business as usual. So tell me, What does the temple of your life need today? What tables in your life need to be overturned? What animals need to be driven out? Once again, what tables need to be overturned? What animals need to be driven out? On this third weekend in Lent, let's ask ourselves these questions. And to guide us in asking these questions, think about what are the things that make your life precious. How does your relationship with God fill your life? How does it make you a better person? When do you turn away? It's okay. It's okay to ask these questions. Because Jesus didn't go into the temple simply for the purpose of overturning temples and scattering animals. He went into that temple so we could be shook up a bit and then return to the God who loves us so.